Hello, everyone. Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is David Kessler, VP of Agriculture and Horticulture at Agrify. Hello, David Kessler. How are you?
I'm doing great, Kevin. How are you doing this fine morning?
I'm doing well. It's another day of cold, dreary weather here in Dallas, Texas, but can't complain. It's a nice change from the hot summer we had. So, yeah. How about you? Where are you located?
You know, I'm in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, and I have to say it's a bright blue sky today, but we are already covered with snow for Halloween, because every Halloween cartoon I ever watched as a child always had snow everywhere. No, it's a treat to be in Colorado, and the weather is beautiful aside from the snow.
Yeah, I was gonna say I had a friend that recently visited there this past week or this week, and there was a lot of snow. It's in fact in New Mexico also they got hit with snow, which is where my family is. So
Oh. You know, when I see the early snows here in Colorado, my heart goes to all of the outdoor hemp and cannabis producers because, you know, you have this ideal schedule of how field production should work. However, if Mother Nature doesn't play nice, you really get put in quite a predicament. And I just hate seeing people lose a lot of their effort, their time, and their livelihood. But you know, I'm sure that most of them saw this coming and were able to get that crop in.
sure. And for those listening, David Kessler, he's the VP of Agriculture and Horticulture at Agrify. And again, those listening, David, he's got a really cool background that he's using on this video call. It's go ahead and talk about it, David. And also, I know that you mentioned
Sure.
earlier that you're walking around, but you are disappearing, and it's a bit distracting. So. Sitting down might be a little better for myself and those watching. Sorry about that.
I am glad to sit down. It's fine. Sometimes I walk and I talk and I pace, but the background behind me was a really exciting and a fun project. I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was working for a hydroponic firm that did commercial design as well as retail and wholesale manufacturing. And a gentleman walked in to the business and clearly needed assistance. I start chatting with him, and it turns out he's looking for a set design for the Hunger Games film franchise. And he lays out a blueprint that someone had made, and I immediately recognize it as a version that was based off of a Thai vertical farm that was being publicized at the time. And he said, "Can you do this?" And I'm like, "I know we can do this because they did it." So I start going through this laundry list of how we would build this image that he had, you know, constructed for the movies. And one thing led to another. And then we built one of these 30-foot tall A-frame gardens. And then the director liked it so much, he said, "Let's do 14." And then 14 turned into 30. And so by the end of this, we took over the Georgia World Congress Center for 6 months. We built a vertical farm that would rival anything that's in production in most of the country, produced over 10,000 living, perfect plants, mostly rhubarbs and Swiss chards and red romaines for the Hunger Games. And on the day of the shoot, it was early January, and everything is perfect. All of the plants are real. The systems actually work. Like, they grew the plants on the set. We built a greenhouse. And then they do the shoot, and unfortunately, they take a little winter break. And it's at that point Philip Seymour Hoffman passes away from a heroin overdose. And because everything in that scene was close up, they cut the entire scene. So it's only available in the deleted clips, but you can go online and you'll find it around minute 11 in Mockingjay. And it's just a fantastic scene, because how would you feed a population living underground? Well, you would feed them by vertical farming, and it makes a lot of sense. And it was just so much fun to do the project.
Right.
It was a real treat.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunate that it got cut. But like you said, if they're check out the deleted scenes and look at it. And my question is, what happened to the actual, like,
The set?
grow the set? What did they do with it? Yeah.
So a friend of mine that had a nonprofit bought all of the lighting, and that went into school system programs that were trying to get agriculture as a part of the STEM curriculum, something that I worked on in Georgia. The actual A-frame gardens were essentially cut apart and just sent for scrap metal. They did keep 4 of them in case there was a reshoot. So there is a storage locker somewhere in Atlanta by the Porsche racetrack that has some of these A-frame gardens. But it was the biggest Grodan order, not coming from a nursery, I think, in the United States at that time. And it was just a massive project. But what I loved was it would have been so easy to mock up on a green screen with some plastic plants. And the director really, really wanted everything to be real and true. So the hydroponic systems functioned, the plants were real, we grew them from seedlings. And as you can imagine, not in an ideal situation. So we're germinating 10,000 plants in the steam tunnels of the Georgia World Congress Center. I can say it really was a guerrilla style grow for this multi-million-dollar film. And you know, the one good thing that really came of it is when the director said, "This is what I want, and I don't care what it costs." He meant it. So, you know, there was no expense spared. If I needed a humidifier or an air conditioner, it was definitely provided.
Yeah, I mean that's that Hollywood budget, man. They go big, and
Go big or go home.
go big or go home. That's right. And it sounds like that was a really cool project to work on. And it just kind of speaks to your background. From what I understand, I think it's over 20 years you've kind of been in the horticulture and agricultural space. And I see that within your current role at Agrify, you're doing a lot of great content. I mean, before we recorded, we talked a little bit about that podcast that you're running, and I really enjoy it, man. I've checked out a few episodes, and you know, you cover a wide range of topics that are very valuable to the listener.
Thank you, Kevin. I really am a plant nerd, deep down and at heart. And I love talking about plants and plant science, but also the change in technology and how it's impacting how we cultivate, especially for cannabis, such an amazing plant, something that is really been largely ignored by academia because of the illegal nature of it. We're still just beginning to scratch the surface of what this plant can do and then how we can best cultivate it. And so it's so much fun to be a part of this industry and to get to share my passion. And I am a big plant nerd. So everything from, you know, the best way to use controlled environmental ag to stimulate different cannabinoid metabolites, to the way lighting technology is changing and the spectrum are going to influence those cannabinoids.
Well, that's one thing. I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm really excited to talk to you about today. But you know, first is what you just mentioned is the lighting technology and how that's evolved. You know, we've had guests on who are experts when it comes to growing, cultivating, things like that. But we really haven't had someone on who can explain the science behind the lighting and when it comes to indoor grows. So, you know, let's talk a little bit about that just to kind of set the stage. From my basic understanding, contemporary indoor cannabis cultivation usually involves at least 3 artificial light sources. So you've got high intensity discharge, you have compact fluorescent, and you have LED. So do we want to kind of start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should start at the beginning, right? And so early on, when people were growing plants indoors, we're talking the 70s, they only really had fluorescent lamps. These are the same tubes that were above us all day long in school when we were growing up and looking up and staring off space. But these fluorescent lamps, you know, they're designed to light for humans. And so they did grow plants, but they weren't great at doing it. Then you have HID lights, or high intensity discharge. This is your metal halide, your ceramic mercury vapor, as well as your high pressure sodium. And those are much, much better at converting electricity into photons that drive photosynthesis. Because at the end of the day, agnostic about the light source, what we're trying to do is convert electrons into photons. And it has to be a particular photon. It has to be a photon within the PAR spectrum, which is 400 to 700 nanometers. That means it will drive photosynthesis. So the more efficient the light at converting an electron into a photon within that spectral range, the better it will do at driving photosynthesis. And the more photosynthesis you can drive per watt of light. So it started with fluorescent, and then it went to these HIDs. And HIDs are good, and they have been good for quite a long time. About 10 years ago, they went from a single-ended arc tube to a double-ended arc tube, which just helped make the uniformity of igniting the gases and exciting those molecules, essentially giving it a better uniformity and a higher output. So if we want to look at it traditionally, and the best way to do it is from the numbers. Your fluorescents we're not even going to go to. They're so inefficient for plant cultivation. If you're not using them for anything other than clone production is probably fine, but they're really not good light sources for vegetative or flowering growth.
Why for clone?
Because clones need so little light. Clones can really, and when I say clone, I'm talking about vegetative propagation, where you actually cut a piece of the branch off and then you try and make it root into a grow media. Those plants can root successfully at under 100 micromoles of light intensity, and they'll root up to about 300 micromoles. Although there's new research saying that you can go much higher. And so the fluorescents do a great job of providing that level of light. But when we start getting into flower production, you really need about 600 micromoles to really drive any decent flower production. And with that in mind, the fluorescents, while they can do it, right, you can have a lot of them, it's very inefficient when you look at how much electricity they take. So what I look to is how much watts of electricity in versus how much light out you get, because that's the real metric of success and efficiency here. So with HIDs, you started at 1 micromole. So back in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, the highest amount was for every watt in, they would make 1 micromole of light out. Now, when they went to those double-ended arc tubes, what people will call double-ended high-pressure sodiums, the bar moved. It went to 1.7 micromoles per watt. And that's a huge jump. That's 70% increase. And you're not spending any more electricity. So think about that. If you think about cannabis yield as corollary to light intensity, right? The genetics determines how much could possibly be yielded, but your intensity of light is going to also dramatically impact yield. To get the same amount of electricity, your electric bill doesn't change 1 month to another. You change your light, and your yield goes up by 70%. And that's purely a factor of the plants having more light for photosynthesis.
And in that example where you're saying you're using less energy, right? You gave that light bill example. Is that the transition from what you just explained, HID to fluorescent?
No, so that was the change from early HIDs into modern HIDs.
Okay, got you.
Okay, now, with that in mind, the electric bill stayed the same. That means that you're using the same amount of electricity, but the output of the light was increased by 70%. Your yield is therefore increased by 70%. And one thing for all of the growers to remember on this call, it doesn't matter what type of light you're choosing, whether it's fluorescent, high pressure sodium, ceramic metal halide, LED, they're all inefficient at converting electricity to light, and they produce heat as a byproduct. 3.4 BTUs per watt. So if it's 1,000 watt light, that's 1,000 times 3.4 and gives you 3,400 BTUs of heat created every time that light is on, for every minute. Now, with that in mind, if I can get more light with the same amount of electricity, then I'm creating the same amount of heat, but I'm driving a higher yield. And that's where the conversation goes from here. Because LEDs came onto the scene, and I gotta tell you, I was so excited. I was looking for a way to reduce heat in my cultivation rooms, and this future was supposed to be LED. But early LEDs came out, they were developed for NASA, and they were really nothing more than colored light bright pegs, red and blue, and they did nothing. They couldn't keep plants alive. And for years, I would try LED lighting, and it just was disappointing. And then they hit a precipice, that a real change happened. And all of a sudden, the efficiencies started getting to the point where they could rival indoor grow lights, like your traditional double-ended high pressure sodium.
What year was that when it started to improve?
Around 2014, honestly, is when they started to right about equal that 1.7 micromoles per watt. And so at that point, you had two choices. I could buy a high pressure sodium for say $400 or $500 at that point, and it would take 1,000 watts and it would turn it into 1,700 micromoles of light. Okay. Or I could spend four times that on an LED and it would use about 700 it would use the 600 watts and it would do it at the same efficiency, but it wouldn't put out as much light because again, if the wattage is lower and the output is lower, because it had the same efficiency as the HID, 1,000 watts versus 600. So what really changed and has continued to change is that LEDs are improving in efficiency and HIDs have really hit their pinnacle. That is their peak. There's really nothing more that they can manipulate within the mixture of gases or the efficiency of the design to gain more output or a higher degree of conversion efficiency. The,
So while while things have gotten better on the LED side, is there still that issue of heat?
for every light source, there's always the issue of heat because it is consistent no matter how you want to think about it. 600 watts times 3.4 BTUs per watt of heat, or 1,000 watts of high pressure sodium times 3.4 BTUs. It's the same. Where we're getting to now, which is really exciting, is that the LEDs have advanced so far past that 1.7 micromole threshold. First it was 2.1, then it was 2.3. Now we're at 2.7, 2.9, even above 3. And there should be a note that in fact we're up at 3.6 and 3.7 in some of the horticultural lighting, but those are solely supplementary lights. That has to go into a greenhouse where the majority of the white light spectrum comes from sunlight, and they're just trying to boost photosynthesis. But for indoor growers, where the light source, the primary source of light or only source of light is either an LED or a high pressure sodium, you need to have what we call a full spectrum, because aside from driving photosynthesis, there's other photo-driven plant biological processes. And that's why the initial work that NASA did on LEDs failed. The initial work on LEDs that NASA conducted was thought around this idea. If the peaks of photosynthesis are at 440 and 660 nanometers, then all of the other light is a waste. All we're trying to do is drive photosynthesis. So if I only provide energy at 440 and at 660, then it's very precise and I'm only using energy to do what I want. There's no waste. Unfortunately, they didn't account for the fact that there's other photobiological processes that require these other spectra of light. There's different metabolites like xanthophylls and anthocyanins that utilize different wavelengths of light differently. And so that you need to provide this full spectrum. So the NASA eventually came around to using full spectrum lighting, and as white light, which is full spectrum, became more prevalent in commercial use, industrial buildings, even around your home, you probably have LED light bulbs now instead of fluorescence or incandescence. Well, the research dollars on the billions of dollar scale that went into white light, because it wasn't horticulture, it was for residential buildings, it was for commercial buildings. The applications and the revenue down the road made it justifiable to put those research dollars in. What it did is it drove not just that white light success, but it also correlated to the improvements in white lights in horticulture. So we benefited from the big industry's investment into white light LEDs because our horticultural LEDs became so much more efficient. So where we are now is around a 2.7 plus micromole per watt efficiency on horticultural LEDs, and a theoretical limit that is theorized somewhere around 4.8 to 5.2. We're nowhere near that yet, but we definitely have lights breaking the 3 mark, which was unheard of even a year ago.
And when you mentioned those numbers, and as they continue to increase, that basically translates to more yield from the plant, right?
Correct. It can either be thought of as more yield from the plant or the ability to cover more space with less or fewer lights. And so ultimately, it translates to either more yield or a lower cost of production for the same yield.
Got you. Okay. So to recap, what you're saying is the horticulture industry benefited from the millions of dollars that were invested into the residential side of transitioning from fluorescent light bulbs to LED or white light bulbs. And it was just kind of an aha moment where someone decided to use this full spectrum LED lighting on their plants because the plants needed more than just the photosynthesis that the light was providing for it?
So it was really that they had realized that they needed more than the red and blue alone, which were the 440 and 660 peaks. And they had started to use white light LEDs, but they weren't that efficient at the time. And to understand, a white light LED is really a blue LED with a coating of phosphorus. And that is what emits that full spectrum or that white colored light. And it's not too different than a fluorescent tube. If anyone's ever accidentally cracked a fluorescent tube open, there's that white phosphor coating. The phosphor releases light when it's excited through electricity or induction lighting magnetic field. But ultimately, what ended up happening was we knew we needed the white lights, but horticulture is such a small subset of lighting that no one's putting in those billions of dollars. But commercial and residential lighting is a huge market, so it made sense to put the money into the R&D. So they developed it for one application, and we kind of co-opted that for horticulture, and now we have fantastic horticultural lights that there is no ceiling in sight, at least at the moment, for their efficacy.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's just amazing how the plant is so unique, right? In so many different ways. But even in the way in which like the lighting affects it and how you mentioned that outside of photosynthesis, there's just so much more that the plant needs. And along those lines, let's talk about phenotypic plasticity or changes in an organism's behavior, morphology, physiology related to its environment. So in addition to lighting, how can the environment impact the plant in different ways as it grows and cultivates?
I'll give you a really good example because I think it's something that is going to be investigated a lot more as we start to have more research into cannabis on an academic level. Um, the environment impacts the plant in lots of ways. You can have the perfect amount of light, but if you never water your plant, it'll die, right? But if you water it all the time or you give it just the right amount of water, it's a happy plant. That's what most people think, right? They want to grow a healthy and happy plant. So they don't want it to drought. They don't want it to overwater and damage it. But here's a good example of how the environment can impact the plant. So when growing herbs, it's a well-known and documented process that they do a very targeted drought period as the plants are maturing. And what it does is it increases the essential oils, the things that really give a lot of the flavor and aroma to the herbs that we're growing. So summer savory and rosemary are great examples of this. By giving it a controlled drought towards the mid to end of its life cycle, you increase the essential oil content. Now, this research is being replicated successfully, very successfully, by multiple universities at this point. And what they're finding for cannabis is that a controlled drought can actually significantly increase the cannabinoid concentrations and the terpene concentrations without affecting the yield. So the environment, which is the amount of moisture the plant has been giving and the way in which that moisture has been given to the plant, can impact the chemical profile of the final product. It's a perfect example of the environment impacting what that final product is.
Wow. So let's take that a step further in terms of like regions, right? And the different climates and how that can affect plant growth and even the way the plant looks, right? I mean, if you think about any type of Kush strain, Afghan Kush and things like that, it's a little shorter, more leafy, right? As opposed to indica strains. So how can different climates, like here in the U.S., like say, compared to the West Coast and the East Coast, how can they differ in terms of morphology and behavior?
Well, what you have to think about for that example is taking a genetically identical plant and planting it in two very diverse locations. So let's have a thought experiment. We take a clone of what would be really good? Something like Bodai's space cake. You take space cake and I plant it in the hills of Humboldt and I plant it in upstate New York, an area I went to school in. Well, Humboldt, very even temperatures on the warmer side, lots of sunshine, almost a perfect amount of rain, and very nutritious soil. New York, much less sunlight, colder temperatures, more rain, but still very nutritious soil. What are going to be the differences? Well, I hypothesize that the plant in New York is going to probably be slower to finish. It's going to yield less because it had less DLI, less sunlight cumulatively. It's going to more likely express a lot of the purple coloration that the strain is known for because the anthocyan is actually brought out by colder temperatures. And so the green chlorophyll degrades and the purples come out and you get these nice, bright, vibrant hues, which are going to be more pronounced in the colder nights of New York. In California, you're going to have more even moisture, more even rainfall. You're going to have a larger yield, probably a bigger growing plant. Won't express as much of that purple coloration because it doesn't have the severity of the cold that the New York cultivated plant had. And so it's going to express phenotypic differences, the outward expression. And even though genetically it's identical to the plant in New York, they're going to look different. They might even taste a little different because light and spectrum impact the metabolite production. So they might have more humulene in the plant over in California than was produced in the plant in New York, and it's going to have a different smell, and it'll look similar, right? Like a brother and a sister, but it won't be identical. And that is a good example of the phenotypic plasticity that you might see in cannabis.
I haven't heard you mention like secondary compounds such as like terpenes. So when you say that lighting really affects the flavor and the smell and whatnot, I mean, are you talking about terpenes also and flavonoid?
Yeah, in the past example, the prior one, humulene is one of the secondary terpenes. Your most common is probably limonene and myrcene, but humulene is a sesquiterpene that's also pretty prevalent in different cannabis strains. It's also very prevalent in hops. Humulene is the same humulene or terpene found in hops that beer is brewed from. So if you ever smell cannabis that has a hoppy kind of flavor, like a beer, that's probably the humulene coming through.
Got you. Yeah, I mean, hops are super potent, and especially if you rub them,
Pardon me.
the aroma can take up the whole room. So, another topic I think it's really important that I'd like you to kind of dive into is, I've mentioned a lot on the podcast how environmentally sustainable planting hemp or cannabis is, right? Because of the amount of CO2 emissions that the plant takes in, and then not to mention how it enriches the soil. But maybe like, from a scientific perspective, kind of speaking to me like a first grader, explain that in a little more detail for the audience.
Sure. I mean, some plants are very utility hungry. And if we're talking about indoor cultivation, then you need to make energy and environmentally conscientious decisions. However, if we're just talking about the plant as a whole, the plant itself grows very well, even in lower quality soils. So it's not going to require a high mineral fertilizer, which means you don't have to continually add fertilizer. Doesn't mean you shouldn't, but it's not as required. It can grow in more difficult soils. The plant is also a phytoremediator, which means if you have toxins in your soil, it will suck those out. It can actually be used to clean up toxic spills and waste sites. Because the plant will accumulate a lot of these heavy metals, it will store them in the tissue. Of course, you won't consume that plant because it would be toxic, but it is making the soil itself healthy again by removing it biochemically. Removing those dangerous heavy metals like mercury and so forth. Now, the other way that cannabis can help in terms of environmental concerns is it's a very good rooting plant. It is a very efficient plant, and it's a very fast growing plant. So instead of making paper out of trees, if they start making it out of hemp, the same amount of paper production can be produced, but instead of killing trees for 30 years, I can cut my field down and replant it next year. The other part about the hemp plant that is so critical, or the cannabis plant, is that it can be used in so many different ways. The flowers, whether it's hemp for CBD type medicine or cannabis, the drug type for THC type derivatives, you have the flowers that can be used for medicine. You have the seeds that can be used for oil. The stalks can be used for paper and fabric. Even the roots can be utilized to make certain medicines as well. So the entire plant can be actually utilized, and that means that we don't have as much waste product. So the energy, the money, the utilities that we put into cultivating can really be maximized instead of having a plant that we throw away 2/3 of it or 3/4 of it, and we're really only after one little piece. Cannabis gives us the opportunity to grow medicine, food oils, fibers, fabrics, textiles, and it's just an amazing plant. And even now, hempcrete is becoming huge. It's a building material. So exciting that this plant can do so much.
Yeah, it's the buffalo of plants. I mean, there's virtually, like you just mentioned, no waste at all from the plant. You can use every aspect of it. Um, and hempcrete is something that I am just fascinated with. I mean, the fact that we're seeing homes being built with hempcrete is incredible. And even in the automotive industry is starting to look to hemp for, hemp plastics for cars and whatnot.
I have a really exciting one for you, okay? Because even I never thought this. So, some research being done by the US Navy has just come out. It's actually come out a couple of years ago. Um, and it turns out that cannabis can produce terpenes. Who would have thought? No, terpenes can be used as jet fuel. They have figured out that they can take certain cannabis based terpenes, mix it with jet fuel, and essentially it makes the jet fuels lighter and more efficient. And so it's not jet fuel itself, but it's an additive to the jet fuel that makes it much more efficient. And so there's now work that cannabis produced terpenes are going to be incorporated into jet fuel. Now, these are only produced in the, thousands or 10,000s or even millions of a part per single part of plant material. But the fact that they are produced and that modern breeding, marker assisted breeding, and eventually I'm sure genetic modification will come in, but that we can get this plant that now not only is producing hempcrete and medicine and food, but now jet fuel of all things. It's crazy.
That is amazing. Wow. That is a knowledge bomb that you just dropped on everyone. That is incredible. Where did you read that? I want to include if you don't mind, maybe send me the link after we record here and I'll add it to the description in the YouTube.
I would love to, and I actually wrote a whole blog about it, so I can send you a link to the blog, man, and your listeners can take a look. I always cite original sources. It's really important for me that we share information. I'm not someone that likes to covet, my findings and other people's. If I find something interesting that I think the community will benefit from, I want to publicize it and get it out there because it moves the needle for everybody.
Awesome.
So
Yeah.
absolutely, I'll shoot that over to you.
Cool. We appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about the growing side now, right? So first, let's start with, I guess we could start with either genetics or growing best practices, because I know that some farmers have approached with sourcing their seeds or maybe using starters or auto flower. So what are your perspectives of those kind of three approaches, and what seems to work best based off of the operation in which you're working out of?
So first, just need to put it out there. Agrify is a non-plant touching company. We build technology to support cannabis cultivation, but we ourselves do not cultivate the cannabis. Now, that being the case, I myself did cultivate cannabis for many, many, many years and continue with a medical license. For that purpose, when it comes to genetics, what we have to appreciate is I'm somewhat agnostic about the source of the starting material. What's important is the quality of the material, and that shouldn't be an unknown. You should buy your clones from a reputable source. You should buy your seeds from a reputable breeder. There's nothing wrong with, seeing a guy on Instagram or Facebook and hitting him up and getting some seeds. But when you're looking for the highest quality, you really want to find someone that has put in the time. When it comes to genetics themselves, you have to think about two factors. This is really a balance of the nature and nurture argument. The genetics are going to determine the possible spectrum of outcome, from really bad to really good. And you can't overcome your genetics. If your parents are both 4 feet tall, the chances of you being 8 foot tall and playing in the NBA are very, very small. So we want to start with genetic material that gives us a chance at really getting to that excellent side of the spectrum. From there, it's all nurture. It's all you, the grower, the environment you create, the light, the temperature, the humidity, the vapor pressure deficit, the CO2 levels, the fertilizer you choose, how it's applied, the growing media, and even how you vary the environment throughout the cultivation process. So there's a lot of work that has been done, and I'm sure a lot of my Rockwool growers will know about crop steering, which is where you actually use the dryness of the air, the fertilizer concentration to force the plant essentially to eat more. And you can manipulate the plant that way if you know how. But again, you can't overcome bad genetics. So start with good genetics, something reputable, give it a really good care as best you can, and you will end up with great results. Now, if you ended up with good results, just remember that can always be evolved. You can push that better and better with better care. Maybe it needed a little more food. Maybe it needed a little warmer temperatures. Through experimentation, you can arrive at really these optimized cultivation recipes and ultimately optimized genetics or genetic expression is really what we're after. And so the Agrify methodology, what we deliver is essentially a very climate controlled growth chamber. You put your plants in and you tell it what you want it to do. I want this level of humidity on this day. I want this temperature. I want it to irrigate this often with this fertilizer. And the software, Agrify Insights, works with the hardware and delivers this constant, very regimented environment exactly as you dialed in. The great thing is most of our cultivators have hundreds of these units. So they can take a strain and they can dial it in at, say, 2 degrees offset in temperature. And then in 5 other units, they might try different light intensities. Very quickly, these small experiments unearth how that genetic likes to be treated to maximize the expression we're going after. Some people might want yield. Some people might want higher terpene levels. So depending on what your goal is, you run through these small iterative experiments and you arrive at technology, that can deliver this genetically maximized plant material. And it's really exciting to kind of work through those experiments and to see a genetic go from really good to exceptional. It's just a great treat.
That technological innovation is incredible. So what you're saying is basically this is an end-to-end automated process where again you do your research and you make sure that you're getting the right genetic to set you up for success to basically get the outcome that you're looking for. But once you've done that and the seed goes in the ground, this software technology basically automates the entire environment by water, soil, fertilizer, all that type of stuff based on the inputs that you're putting into the program?
Yes. So obviously, if you want it to deliver a certain fertilizer, you have to hook up the fertigation system to it. But yes, the software, Agrify Insights, what it does is it allows you to customize a recipe for cultivation for every growth chamber, every VFU. We call it precision elevated because there's a lot of precision in growing, but to really get to that next level, which we believe is the future, because the phenotypic plasticity that we talked about earlier with those 2 plants in New York, when it comes to the consumer or a medical patient, they really need that same experience when they buy a strain that helps them with glaucoma or that helps them with seizures. Chemical variation on that strain really impacts its efficacy. So when they come in 2 months later and it's the same strain from the same grower, but the greenhouse, it's a different time of year and the light intensities are different. So the strain didn't produce as much of the chemical compounds that really benefited that patient. They're not going to get the same level of efficacy from the product. And so by having a controlled environment, a very high fidelity, granularly controlled environment, we can minimize that variation, and that patient will get the highest degree of consistency from crop to crop. And for growers that have grows in multiple states, you can deliver that consistency because that recipe, that internal environment is identical. So you just shift it over to the new facility, and the plants, again, they cultivate, they grow beautifully. It's the future of technology.
Hmm. And I understand that this future of technology would be well suited, specifically within the medicinal side of cannabis, because, like you mentioned, those prescriptions, those potency levels, they all need to be dialed in. They got to be right, right? They got to be
Hmm.
exact, and it's got to be a constant product that patient's receiving. So, and I understand that there's more money invested in this type of technology to cater to that particular segment of the market. So are you saying that it's going to take some time for this technology to be implemented more broadly into the adult use or recreational side? Like, is that going to be more hands-on human cultivation for now?
Well, it's a lot of speculation, and no, I think that the adult use market is going to be driven largely by two factors. One is efficiency of production. You're going to have these large mega producers, your Budweisers and your Coors, that are looking for high grade quality at a very cost efficient price, good enough. And then you're going to have these, what I would liken to craft breweries in beer, craft producers that are really focused on high quality, something unique, whether it's a strain that's specific or whether it's a genetic profile that's a little bit different and unique that differentiates themselves. However, what's driving both of these players is going to be the fact that they have to produce at a certain price point that the market is going to demand, right? If my craft producer is, costs him $2,000 per pound to grow, my Budweiser guy is producing it at $400 per pound, and the market only pays $1,000 per pound wholesale, that craft producer is out of business. So in terms of the adoption of technology, it'll be driven by cost efficacy because this method of production is much more cost efficient. It's much more reliable and dependable. And that reliability means that you can make sure that your adult use cannabis is produced on schedule at a fair price, but giving it that craft quality. So I think the adoption will be pretty marked across both the medical and the adult use market. What would help is if consumers in the adult use market really had more demand for consistency. If you like a product, tell the dispensaries, tell them, say that the grower deserves a lot of props. All congratulations to the grower, all props to the grower. Because if you liked it, let them know. That will go a long way. They will tell that farm. And if they can do that consistently, if they can produce a varietal that you really enjoy, giving that props to the grower will only encourage them, and it will also let the dispensary know that you like that product. And so I think that what we're going to see is price driving the adoption of the technology, but the more consistency is demanded by the consumer, the quicker that technology will be more pervasive in the industry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that at a minimum, that would be a good step for consumers to take, is to provide that feedback so that, the growers and the cultivators know, so they can do their best to continue to produce that same product. But in fairness, also, I mean, there still is a huge education gap when it comes to the efficacy of the cannabinoids found in cannabis, right? Whether it be THC or CBD or CBG or CBN. And due to the federal scheduling, right, it's kind of inhibited that learning curve and and the ability to produce and issue these peer review studies. So um, the education still has the ways to go, I think, in that way also.
It definitely does. And what we're starting to get when we talk about the more modern research on cannabis, the bulk of it, the vast majority is on hemp, because with the Farm Bill passing, hemp became a viable crop for government-funded universities to work with. Government funding, the way they kept research universities from working with cannabis as a drug type is they threatened to pull all of the funding that the government provided for these universities if they touch a plant that was illegal. So they wouldn't do the research because it literally meant if they wanted to research drug type cannabis, they would lose all of their funding. So with hemp bills, the farm bill passing, hemp is now a viable product. We're getting the most amazing research, Kevin. There are studies that look at the maturation of terpenes, both monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, and cannabinoids through the life of the plant. There's a great study that takes a weekly sample and measures the cannabinoids and terpenes for 6 months. For 6 months, they keep the plant alive, 3 months in veg and 3 months in flower, which is a long time. And they just document the cannabinoids and the terpenes. It's fascinating. We have studies coming out now on lighting science where we're seeing the effects of far red light and UVA and UVB light on the plant in controlled scientific studies. So it's an exciting time to see this knowledge coming about. And while there is an incredible dearth of education and knowledge, the opportunity for research right now is amazing because this plant is 100 years behind most of your agricultural commodity plants in terms of the academic knowledge. The most basic research to irrigation strategies, all the way out to cutting edge research, manipulating the metabolites through narrow wavelength spectral changes. It's all at our fingertips. If you guys are nerdy like me, if you're plant scientists, go back to grad school. If you can't go back to grad school, just start reading the white papers out there. All of these studies are peer reviewed and published. And I'll give you a little tip. I found it many years ago, and it has been a lifesaver for me. Everyone loves Google, or at least most people use Google if they don't love it. But there's a subsect of the search engine called Google Scholar. And Google Scholar only looks up academic peer-reviewed research journals. It eliminates all of the noise, the marketing, the guy trying to sell you tomato seeds that grow upside down or whatever. And it just gives you this really high quality research. So if you go to Google Scholar and you're interested in on the impact of, say, wavelengths of light on cannabis, you can type in wavelength nanometer cannabis, and it'll bring up a host of scientific studies around those keywords. But it's a great way to kind of look at the academic research and kind of get rid of some of the bro science that is still in the industry. And there's nothing wrong with learning from your peers. We just don't want to proliferate bad information.
Sure. No, that's a great tip. You heard it from David. Google Scholars, look up these academically peer-reviewed studies. That's a really great first start. And, to respond to what you said, it is encouraging to see that there is a lot of progress being made when it comes to research and peer-review studies as it relates to hemp on the agricultural commodity side, right? Because it's really important that we're dialing in and how we can effectively grow this plant to yield and live up to its most potential is kind of how I'll put it. But what I hope is that because we are inhibited with testing cannabis from a medicinal perspective on humans, and mostly around the world, I think there's only 2 countries that allow for that right now. I'm hoping that if cannabis does become federally legal in this country, that there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration together with both sides, right? From the agriculture commodity side to say, hey guys, look, we've really narrowed this down in science. And obviously you guys are taking a medicinal approach to this. But when that happens, I think that the learnings will be even more, right?
Absolutely. When the essentially the constraints of research are lifted or even shackles loosened, we're going to have that many more people researching, actively providing new vantage points, new information, looking at the plant in different ways. And our knowledge base is absolutely going to grow in kind. And regardless of the outcome of the election, which I know is only days away, I think that we are looking at a very bright future for cannabis, both in the United States and globally. And that if this is something that you're passionate about, that you're interested in, I just got to tell you, it's a viable career now, everybody. When I was young, my young self would have kicked myself if I knew where I was headed, because I would have been so excited. But it is a viable career path. It's an amazing plant. It's a cornucopia of medicine and products. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of. So, research, read, share with your friends. It's just a great time to be into cannabis.
Well said, David. Yes, you heard it from him firsthand. And hey, I really appreciate you sharing your insights today. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that my audience learned a lot as well. So, David, before we sign off, is there any websites that you want to point our listeners to, or any social media channels?
Absolutely. You can find Agrify on Facebook and Instagram, but please come to our website, agrify.com. That's agrify.com. And if you have any questions about something specific that I was discussing today, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is David.Kessler, Kessler, at agrify.com. I hope you do reach out, and I hope we get to start some interesting conversations. Maybe you're the next plant scientist that's going to publish the study.
Love it. And David, hey, really appreciate you blazing the trails when it comes to all these insights and expertise regarding growing, cultivation, lighting, etc. And I'll continue to follow Agrify and all the great things that they're doing when it comes to producing premium grow solutions.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me. It's been a treat. I love this. And again, thank you so much. I hope all your listeners have a wonderful day. And I hope I get to talk to you all again real soon.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.